Kia ora students, this is the first tutorial to help you to write an essay about the Hunger Games. Remember, there's always going to be these 11 steps of how to write an essay, and this is step 1, choosing a question. Here are 5 questions that are actually taken from the Year 11 exam from 2014. So this is very similar to something that you might get asked when you actually do Level 1 next year. So I'm going to read through each question quickly. If you don't want to listen to me read it, you could pause now and just read it to yourself. And then I'm going to tell you how I would go about choosing the question that I am going to work with. Question 1. Describe at least one character or individual you could relate to in the text. Explain why being able to relate to the character or individual was important to the text as a whole, supporting your points with visual and or oral language features. That little bit is at the end of every single one of the questions, so I'm not going to repeat that each time. Question 2. Describe at least one important idea the director/creator developed throughout the text. Explain how this idea helped you to understand an important message for teenagers. 3. Describe at least one important setting in the text. Explain how the setting helped you to understand one or more characters or individuals in the text, supporting your points with 4. Describe the opening scene or section of the text. Explain how the opening scene or section helped you to understand an important message in the text. 5. Describe at least one important conflict in the text. Explain how this conflict helped you understand one or more characters or individuals in the text. I just said text so many times. Okay, so I like all of these questions. There were actually 7 questions originally in the external exam paper that I took these from, and I deleted 2 of them because I felt they didn't really work well for the Hunger Games. So you could do any of these questions if you wanted to, but I'm going to explain why I've chosen the one I'm going to work with. So describe at least one character that you could relate to, and then explain why being able to relate to the character was important. Yep, we could do that, but you guys are so used to doing character questions. I think they're actually very, very easy, so it's time to challenge yourselves. Describe at least one important idea the director developed throughout the text. Explain how this idea helped you understand an important message for teenagers. That one, I think, is actually a little bit more challenging than what I would like to work with, because it says that bit about an important message for teenagers. I kind of feel like it's a little bit limiting. If you really want to be working towards getting an advanced excellence, you really want to challenge yourselves to do some really good analysis, then messages for teenagers may be a little bit limiting for that. You know, we want to go wider. We want to talk about messages for like humanity or something like that. The important setting question, I really was tossing up between doing this one or question number 4. So if you don't like question number 4, then I would go for the important setting question, because when you're talking about the Hunger Games, you could talk about the capital, you could talk about District 12, obviously the Hunger Games arena itself. You could also be more specific than that. You could talk about I can't remember the place, where they have the reaping. I can't remember where they do that. I think it's just called like the town square or something. That's a very specific setting within District 12. Or, for example, you could talk about the cave where Juno, getting my text confused, where Katniss and Peter hide away in the cave. So you can be really, really specific. You could talk about Panem in general. That could be one setting that you talk about, or you could break it down and be as detailed as you'd like. So I really like talking about setting, and as it says there, you know, you can talk about not just actual physical locations, but you could also talk about time and circumstances. So, for example, the circumstances might be that this is a dictatorship basically run by President Snow, or time might be interesting to talk about, the way that time is used in the actual Hunger Games to speed things up. Remember when Peter at one point asks, "What time is it?" because it's getting dark, and Katniss says, you know, I think they're trying to make things go faster. They're trying to make the finale happen. So lots and lots of different things you could do there. I also, question 5 is a really good one. about conflict. And if you want to talk about that, just remember that conflict might be between two people. It might also be in someone's mind, and it might be between a person and nature, or a person and animals, which is also kind of nature. So you don't just have to limit yourself to Katniss and Haymitch didn't like each other and so they had conflict. Katniss faces conflict all the time. She's actually a very conflicted character. So the first time we see her, the first major time we see her facing conflict is when she decides to volunteer as tribute. You know, everything, biologically, everything in her body would be saying, no, don't do this. Like, your sole purpose in this world is to live for as long as you can, and yet she has to save her sister. So there's these two things that conflict for her. So that would be a very good question to work with. But for this tutorial, I am going to discuss the opening scene, and I'm going to talk about how the opening scene helps us to understand an important message in the Hunger Games. So question number 4 is the one that I'm going to be working with. If you have been struggling at all with essay writing, then I recommend that you do question 4 with me. The reason why I'm saying you can do it when we're working with film is because it's so much easier to find a huge array of examples of techniques when you're working with film, because there's so much going on. You know, there's all different, there's music and the costume and the camera shots and the camera movement and the editing and all this different stuff. So there's no way that you're going to end up writing the same thing as me, and if you did, then I would notice. So that is how you would go about choosing a question. And now I'm going to talk about how you can work out what the question is asking you. But I definitely recommend you pause at this stage if you are going to choose one of those other questions. Okay, this should be really, really straightforward at this stage for you guys now. It's just about working out, what does this question even mean? Kind of like translating it for yourself. Okay, so description always becomes your examples, or your examples become your description. Opening scene, you've got to talk about the start of the film. You can't talk about the end, you can't talk about the middle. You might compare it to the end or the middle, but your main focus has to be on the opening scene. And in this case, when we're writing an essay like this, you get to decide what the opening scene is, within reason. You know, you can't talk about the first hour of a 2-hour film. But in the case of the Hunger Games, it does go for about 20 minutes. It's not like a 2-minute opening scene. And it isn't actually just one scene. You know, that's why they say opening scene or scenes or section of the text. This one does go on for 20 minutes. There are a few different scenes in there. We start off, we're watching Seneca Crane and that guy, the guy with the big teeth. We're watching them talk about the Hunger Games, about the lead up to it, and then we see Katniss and her sister, and then Katniss goes hunting, and then Katniss gets dressed for the reaping, and then we have the reaping, and then we have the farewells, and that's the end of the opening. So it's really, it's up to you to define what the opening of the film is. Explain and how becomes your explanation and your analysis. Important message is like another way of saying themes or ideas. So what is the director trying to tell us? What is a message that the director is trying to get across through the scene that we're talking about? And how does he or she, how do they help us to understand that message? And lastly, this is really, really important. This whole thing about supporting your points with visual and or oral language features, if you don't have this, then you're not actually going to have answered the question. It's actually your description, it's your examples, but the reason that they've put it in the level 1 exams is to make it very clear to students that you must talk about those things like costume, dialogue, camera shots. You can't just say dialogue, dialogue, dialogue every time. And that's because, the reason they point that out to you is because when you write your essays about like The Giver, you do just use dialogue. And then when you come to write about film, sometimes you forget and you just decide, right, I'm just going to quote Katniss in 3 different times in my 3 different paragraphs and that's it. That does not show that you understand how films work and how directors tell a story and send a message. So that's why you have to use that range. So we're aiming for at least 3 visual and or oral language features. And by the time you get to writing your examples, you should have a really strong understanding of what that kind of thing is, but it's always looking at all those things that we can see and hear on the screen, not just the dialogue. It's so much more than that. So much of what goes on in a film is actually not dialogue. It's all that extra stuff that we can see and hear that helps us to understand what's happening. So never, ever, ever forget to do your examples and make sure that they are those techniques. Fantastic. So now you've worked out what the question is asking you. Hopefully you've chosen your own question. If you want to really have some extension and really challenge yourself, you're doing hopefully a different question. And your next step is to actually go through the process of planning that so that you're ready to write your essay.